You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Kristen Harmel.
I'd like to thank some sponsors who, due to their generous support of the show, help bring this to you each and every time we bring you the show. From Eamon Ambrose, author of the best-selling sci-fi serial 0 Hour, comes a new novelette, Love and Other Algorithms. When Frank, a personal robot assistant, meets a similar model named Shelley, they are inexplicably linked and form an instant bond. But when outside forces conspire to separate them, Frank must decide how far he will go to save their relationship. However, all is not as it seems, and as Frank searches for Shelley, he learns that they are both part of something much, much bigger. Out now from Amazon, Love and Other Algorithms by Eamon Ambrose. Hey authors, are you looking for a beautiful professional cover for your science fiction or fantasy book? Holly Heisey Designs offers custom illustration and cover design with characters that will put your people center stage, spaceships designed from the ground up and scenery that makes your world come alive. Visit Holly Heisey Design to book a custom cover or view pre-made ebook covers ready to purchase. Holly is an award-winning illustrator and designer who's done work for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the Future Chronicles anthology series, and USA Today and Amazon.com best-selling authors. Holly will bring your story world to life and get you a cover that will help sell your book. Visit hollyheiseydesign.com for more information on how to book your custom cover design or purchase pre-mades, as well as join the Holly Heisey Design Facebook group for discounts and first dibs at all the new spaceship and fantasy pre-made covers. Find all of this at hollyheiseydesign.com. A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson, a military sci-fi political thriller set just a short decade from now in 2031, holding to the concept of individual liberty can get you killed. Western civilization is in collapse, a process led and driven by the world's leading supposed democracies, our own included. What was once the Western world's guiding light of liberty is quickly being replaced by state-sponsored serfdom under the guise of a global economic reset done in the name of the workers. This is an exciting new novel by an exciting new talent, a debut novel, the first in a series from a former CIA operations officer who has decided that his lifelong writing habit, hobby, obsession is more fun than real work. Go pick up a copy today of A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson. There's a link to all of our great sponsors in the show notes at hankgarner.com. Stick around at the end of our excellent interview today for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. As always, thanks for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have international best-selling author Kristen Harmel on the show with me today. Kristen has a brand new book that is releasing soon called The Room on Rue Amelie, and it is a fascinating book. I think you guys are really going to love it. Welcome to the show, Kristen.
Hi, thanks, and thanks for the kind words about the book.
Oh, you're welcome. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, that is a great question. Oh, geez. You know what? Honestly, I've been making up stories as long as I can remember. I remember putting my younger brother and sister in plays that I had written, that I cast and we performed for my parents. And the first tangible evidence I think I have of me wanting to be a writer is that the day to get out when I was 6, which the Bobbsey twins have to retrieve my father's stolen solid gold tuxedo. And I don't know why I thought my father would have a solid gold tuxedo, but apparently that made sense to a 6-year-old. So basically, as long as I can remember, I've been writing.
So your father loved attention? Is that what I'm...
I think it was more like I was confused about tuxedo making textiles.
Right.
Probably, yes.
I get it. It happens. That I have heard so many people lately say that they began by making books of their own, and they all have a similar story. That you write this book, make a cover, staple it together. There is something about that age range where everything is possible. And
you're absolutely right.
What kinds of things did you love to read at that time?
Oh, goodness. Well, at that time, I was reading a lot of Bobby Twin books, which were, they were from my grandparents' attic. My mother had read them growing up in the 1950s. So they were, old hardcover Bobbsey Twin books with Nan and Bert and Flossie and Freddie. I don't know if anyone remembers the Bobbsey Twins. And I also loved Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. That was kind of, when I was 6 or 7 and making books, that's what I was trying to imitate.
So, did that, was it the mysteries that you loved and seeing kind of kids your age kind of unwinding these mysteries? Did that appeal to you?
You know what I think it was? And that's a great question. I don't know that I've ever actually thought about that before, but I think that it was being able to see a version of the self I wanted to be in those stories, in that I got to see kids my age or kids a little bit older who were taking the initiative to do things and help people and, have some power and some enterprise in their own lives. And I think that was really appealing. And I haven't thought of this before, but I feel like maybe that's one of the reasons why we read, particularly as kids, to sort of find ourselves in the book and to find ourselves doing things that we wish we could do that are a little bit beyond the scope of our normal daily lives. So yeah, maybe from a young age that whole idea appealed to me.
I love asking people what some of those formative books were that they loved, because in a lot of cases you can see threads of that seep into their writing, that whatever connected with you at a young age seems to hang on with you, and those story ideas or maybe character threads tend to hang on with us for a long time.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when people ask me what my favorite book was growing up, I think to sort of my early teen years when I was really into the Diary of Anne Frank. I mean, it was something I probably read for the first time at 11 or 12, and it stuck with me. And, I think for the same multitude of reasons that it has stuck with, millions and millions of people across the globe. But I didn't start off writing about World War II, but that's sort of what I've circled back to. And I think it's probably largely because Anne Frank has been in my head, since I was a young teenager. So it is interesting to think about how the books you read as a young person really do influence the person you turn out to be and the author you turn out to be if you become a writer.
Well, and that subject matter, Anne Frank especially is one of those books we think about it as something that middle schoolers are introduced to, and you connect with the character of Anne on a very on one level, as a middle schooler, and then you read that book again as an older teenager, or maybe as an adult, and you connect with a story on an entirely different level.
You're right.
Yeah,
yes,
and I think that's one of those things that's so endearing about that book in particular, and those types of stories, is that it's something we continue to learn from over and over again.
No, you are absolutely right. I think that is an absolutely great point. Yes.
Were you a history buff? Did what kind of stoked your other than Anne your desire to kind of dig in and see what happened before?
Well, you know what? In high school and in middle school, I had great history teachers. So I think that while I was drawn more to English in school and to literature in school, I think honestly it was because of those teachers that I became immersed in history. And I think back to that often and think, gosh, what a difference it makes when you have really, really good teachers who are passionate about their subject and who want to share that passion with you. I think, maybe that's one of the reasons that history has always been fascinating to me, because I had some teachers that brought that alive. But again, that's not what I started off writing about. I wrote my first book back in 2003 when I was 24, and it was kind of right at the height of that chick lit craze, and I wrote a chick lit book because that made sense when I was 24, and it made sense, around 2003, 2004. That's just kind of the type of book that a lot of people were reading then, and the type of book that made sense at that age. But yeah, I think there was always this interest in history and this thought that the past is so important, and that we're still so connected to the past, whether we see those threads of connection in our daily lives or not. So I think when I finally began writing historical fiction or books that tied in historical fiction elements, that was something that was just fascinating to me. The idea, particularly as I got older, that I was so influenced by what had come before me, by the people in my family that had come before me.
Did you know when you went to college that you were going to pursue writing?
Yes, absolutely. I often joke when I give talks that I never really wanted to be anything else except for a brief period when I was 3, and I would tell people I wanted to play the piano in a bar at night and pump gas during the day because I liked the smell of gasoline. My mother shares that story sometimes. So it was just, I guess I would just wax poetic about the smell of gasoline. But and then there was a brief period when I was about 9 that I was convinced I was going to be a pop star named Mystica. But I can't really sing, and auto-tune hadn't been invented yet, or that I know of, or that I didn't know about at the time. So both of those career aspirations were out. But other than those 2 brief blips on the screen, I've always wanted to be a writer. So yes, when I went off to college at the University of Florida, I did know I wanted to be a writer, but I felt I needed to make sure that I had the ability to have a day job while I thought about, writing a novel. And so I started off as a journalist. I majored in journalism.
Well, I think gas station attendant, nightclub singer, and pop star, I think there's an unrequited dream there that needs to be written about.
Exactly, that's right. Well, hey, it's a solid fallback plan if novel writing ever doesn't work out, right?
That's right. There's always something, and you don't have to be good at math for those either. So
that is true. This is definitely a requirement I would need. I'm not particularly great at math. Yes,
that's a throwback joke to before we started recording that
yes,
the rest
exactly.
of you just won't have any context for, but we laughed. So.
Yes, I was saying, thank goodness people pay me for writing because there is nothing else I'm capable of doing.
I love it. What sort of journalism did you start in?
Interestingly enough, I started off as a sports writer, and I really thought that's what I wanted to do. I actually, my first sports writing job was when I was 16, and I pitched a local sports magazine in the town I grew up. I grew up in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is a part of Tampa Bay. And I pitched a magazine called Tampa Bay All Sports without telling them how old I was. And I got my first assignment, my first professional magazine assignment, disguising myself as an adult, basically. They had no idea they were assigning this little 16-year-old to go interview Major League Baseball players. So it was sort of a whole funny story. They did eventually find out how old I was, and there was this moment of, what? Huh? And then finally, thank goodness, the editor, a wonderful man named Al Martino, finally said, well, I guess you can write, so I guess the age doesn't make a difference. So before I even went away to college, I was covering Major League Baseball and NFL football and occasionally NHL hockey for a local sports magazine. And I also was writing for the St. Petersburg Times, which is now the Tampa Bay Times, which was the local newspaper. And then I went off to college and I had a couple of internships, including one at People magazine. And when I graduated from the University of Florida, I went right into a job with People magazine. So I wrote for People on and off for, I think 12, 13, 14 years. It was a long time, including overlapping several years with the beginning of my novel writing career.
Wow. I find it very interesting that you started writing sports journalism. Did you learn anything that you can put your finger on from writing sports that has helped you in your novel writing career?
That's a good question.
I find it, a great sports writer points out things that you don't get just from watching the game on TV or whatever. Are there things that as a journalist you look for? Is it just an eye that makes certain details pop out? What is it about that?
That's a good question. I've actually never really thought before about how sports writing connects to novel writing. Goodness gracious, I don't know. The biggest takeaway from that was the ability to do the box score of a baseball game, I suppose, right? Although I'm not even sure I could still do that. even when I was writing sports, so for the St. Pete Times, I would just do like game recaps for minor league baseball, high school baseball, and high school basketball, if I'm remembering correctly. But for the magazine, I did more feature type stories, which was always kind of what I wanted to do. And I think what appealed to me about writing feature sports stories, which were usually profiles of players or managers, I think what appealed to me, or coaches, I think what appealed to me about that was the idea that everybody has a story and everybody's story is interesting. So, you might just see this guy as a guy on the field who, I don't know, hit a home run in this game, but like there's a backstory and what made him want to play baseball. And I mean, that sounds silly. I know that's what all personality profiles are, but I think being able to realize that every single person on this planet has an interesting story worth telling has probably translated somewhat to being a novelist in terms of thinking of characters as needing to be well-rounded, which is probably something I do better now than I did at the beginning of my career. I think when I started off, writing chick lit back when I was in my early 20s, my characters were a little bit flatter, but I'd like to think that maybe I've applied some of those journalistic lessons to creating more well-rounded characters now.
The point about the personality pieces or whatever, that showing the humanity of a player and showing the story that every human has. And there's something that really connects us when we see that our heroes, air quotes heroes, are real people and they have real struggles and real, not only do we relish the victory on the field, but to see, especially a rags to riches story or maybe a redemption story or something like that just really makes you connect with the people involved on the field. And I think that's what we all hope for, is that not only that our team wins, but that someone who is inherently good prevails.
You are so right. Good point. Yes.
So you were working for People magazine. What kind of a gear shift was that for you going into, I would assume, a lot of entertainment writing?
Yes. So at the beginning of my career at People, they still had a bureau system. So the country at that time for People was divided up geographically, and I worked for the Miami bureau, which covered the Southeast. So instead of having one particular beat, we were all sort of just assigned regional stories that would appear in the national magazine, but it was sort of a way of, I think, having feet on the ground everywhere, if that makes sense, and really being able to cover the whole country.
And keeping a regional flavor.
Yes, exactly. And there were no regional editions of the magazine. It all went into the national magazine, but every issue there would be articles from around the country, I would say. And so toward the beginning of my career, I did a lot of things like going to the Super Bowl and going to the NBA All-Star Game and going to the MTV Movie Awards and things like that, where you would do red carpets and events with people. And so that was a lot of just or even going to nightclubs, like if a celebrity was throwing an event at a nightclub and they had invited the media. It was the kind of thing where you would go and sort of do the red carpet and interview people and that sort of thing, which in my early 20s was really, really exciting and cool. I mean, it was just, to be, I think 22 or 23 and to be invited to the Super Bowl, like it was an amazing, like what a neat job, right? But the stories I wound up finding more fulfillment in, and that I began to do far more of, particularly as People drifted away from the bureau system and sort of reorganized. My beat became the hero stories, which were the heroes among us stories, which were the stories of normal people, non-celebrities doing good things. And that was something that I think led very naturally into my novel writing, because it was exactly the kind of creative writing I wanted to be able to do. And again, going back to sort of what you and I were just saying, it was interesting about sports stories. It was finding these people who were heroes who you wanted to root for, but who the world might not yet have heard of. So I just got to do, so many fascinating stories with people and interview people who were really making a difference.
That's awesome.
It was neat.
Yeah. So what was the motivation for writing that first novel?
So the first novel, which came out in early 2006, but which I wrote in 2003 and early 2004, the novel was called How to Sleep with a Movie Star. Not a real how-to guide, I always specify. Although as a side note, if you're going to write a novel, How to Sleep with a Movie Star, and you are a short blonde magazine journalist, you should probably not make the protagonist a short blonde magazine journalist, unless you want people to get the wrong idea. So
these are real life lessons, people.
Exactly. Live and learn, right? It was sort of just a light, fun novel about a young journalist who gets involved in a situation where she's hanging out with this movie star. Her love life is a total disaster. And it's like how her life unravels because of this retarded whatever. So kind of like a little Cinderella story or something along the lines set in the magazine. The inspiration of that, honestly, very much doing with People magazine. They always say write to know, and I think that's great advice for a first novel. And at the time, what I knew, I really wrote about the world I was in. And it's funny, one of the criticisms of that book was something about how I think it said something like if the main character, or if this novel were a person, it would be tucking its hair nervously behind its ear, and I was like, gosh, I really did write what I knew, because that's exactly how I was at the time. I was like this little nervous, like, oh, I want to do everything right, and I don't want to offend anybody and whatever, and that's exactly who I was. So I apparently went a step too far in writing what I knew. I was completely exposed on the page.
That's awesome. That was a chick lit book you described.
Yes.
And you said that was kind of the in vogue thing at the time. How many of those types of books did you write?
4 of those types of books. How to Sleep with a Movie Star, The Blonde Theory, The Art of French Kissing, which is also not a how-to book, and Italian for Beginners. So those were my 4 sort of light, fun books that I wrote that had a little bit of comedy, a little bit of romance. I would call them romantic comedies.
Yeah, a tongue firmly placed in cheek.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what? Well, obviously you were having fun writing those. You wrote 4
Yes.
of them. I think the tendency is maybe sometimes we switch to more serious subject matter, and we kind of especially early in your career, you tend to look back on some of that stuff and say, well, that's when I was in this phase or whatever. But
Yep.
those books are absolutely the foundation of who we become. And
Absolutely.
I am not in favor of looking back on early work with disdain, because
no,
I think
not at
it's
all.
I
Yeah.
think it's all part of who we are. But when did you decide that you wanted to switch gears a little bit and start writing historical pieces and things like that?
It was after I had written Italian for Beginners, which came out in, I think, 2009, if I'm remembering correctly. That was the year I turned 30. And I think that it was just sort of the fact that I had grown up a little bit as a person. So, and I totally agree with you about looking back at that phase in my career and not having any regrets about it. I mean, I really enjoyed writing that kind of book, and I still get a kick out of opening some of those books. I think anytime you look back at your earlier work, you see things you wish you could have done better. But I mean, I think that is true for anything we do in life, because obviously we're always learning, we're always growing, and if you're in the same career for a long time, I think inevitably, hopefully, you become better at what you do.
Well, and that's why writers have deadlines, because even if it's a current work in process, you'll continually look back and think about things you would change.
Well, I know a lot of writers who actually won't read their books once they're published, and I mean, it is sort of an uncomfortable feeling, because I think you're used to being able to change things during the editing process, but once it's published, I mean, it's done. Like you can't rephrase a sentence, you can't do anything differently. So, but yeah, I do look back at those books with pride. I mean, I think it was a neat way to start a career, and I still have people write me emails about those books, because they're still out there. You can still get them, and they're fun. It was just a different phase of my career. So after I wrote Italian for Beginners, and I think I sort of had that feeling of, okay, well, I'm entering my 30s now, and life's a little bit different, and I've grown up a little bit, and the things I'm interested in reading are a little bit different. And, as we mentioned about Anne Frank earlier, I think that I always had that time period in the back of my head. I had enjoyed Anne Frank's diary so much and had read it so many times as a teenager. I think it really left an impression on me. And I came up with the idea for The Sweetness of Forgetting, which ended up being my novel that was published in 2012. But I came up with that idea, and it took a little while to convince my agent that it was something I could do. I actually wound up leaving one agent and getting my current agent because my old agent, I think, didn't see it as something I was capable of. I think it looked like I had, that I was a chick lit writer and I wrote light comedy. And I knew that I wanted to be doing something different and something a little bit deeper. And so I found a new agent and wrote the book. I think I wrote the entire book before selling it. And we went out with it. And it has just felt like such a fit since then. I'm still interested in writing the lighter stuff. I think I might maybe think about doing screenplays at some point and maybe try to put some of those lighter ideas into scripts. But I feel very at home writing about history right now.
I'm really intrigued that when you switch genre, that you switched agents, and did you really feel like that was a necessity to get someone who didn't have the preconceived notions of who you are and the work that you did?
Yes. And it was such an unsettling thing to do. I mean, I really liked my old agent. It was just that we were on different pages about how we saw my career proceeding. And I just didn't feel like I had more of that light type of book in me, if that makes sense. It just wasn't really what I was reading anymore. It wasn't, and it wasn't what felt right to be writing anymore. And yeah, it was one of the most difficult career decisions I've ever had to make. And like I said, she was a lovely agent. And it was very unsettling to be out there in the publishing world for the first time in years without somebody. But I was very, very, very lucky to find Holly Root, who is my current agent, who is just the loveliest human being in the entire world, who had the same vision for my career future that I did, which I think is really important. I think you and your agent should pretty much be on the same page about where you see your career hopefully going. So she's just been a godsend. I mean, nothing but supportive and wonderful. So yeah, it's been a good switch.
A lot of writers are really scared to switch genre, and but because you think, well, my present readers, maybe they don't like the things that I am interested in now. Maybe they won't follow me. Did it feel like you were completely rebooting your career?
It did in a lot of ways. I suppose there were threads of the old books in the new book, if that makes sense. So The Sweetness of Forgetting, my 2012 book, is kind of written in a way where 2 chapters take place in the present, 1 in the past, 2 in the present, 1 in the past, that sort of thing. So it's a much deeper story than I had written before. It is about a woman who finds out that her grandmother, who now has dementia, actually had a secret past buried in the Holocaust. And she sets out to put together the missing pieces of the grandmother's past before it's too late, sort of before the grandmother entirely slips away. So it's this love story rooted in the past that kind of we carry into the present. And then the present day character learns lessons about her own life based on what she discovers about her grandmother's life. But I think that the present day love story had notes of what I had done before. So in a way, it was a completely different type of book for me, but it was also a book that I would think, or I do think, was sort of a smooth transition from the older books. So if you were a reader of mine from the previous generation of books, I think it would have been a book also that appealed to you, I think. So it ended up, it could have been scary and it could have completely crashed and burned, but I think it worked out well because of that.
I've had a lot of guests lately, it seems, last few months, who are writing historical fiction, especially rooted in World War II and Europe, and deal with the people that were involved in the Holocaust and the fallout and all of the. Do you have any sense of what it is? There seems to be a cultural thread right now that really has us interested, that we really want to know these stories. And maybe kind of my personal theory is that a lot of these survivors are really aged now. And
Yes.
we're gonna lose these
Yes.
stories
Yep.
if we don't capture them now. Is that kind of the what you're feeling? I'm really interested to know why this seems to be such a groundswell. And these books are so popular, but not only that, before the books can be popular, the writers had to have been sensing something, that these stories needed to be told.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's interesting to me because I feel like I wrote The Sweetness of Forgetting, the book I was just talking about, a little bit before it became sort of a trend in publishing. Because you're right. Right now, there are a ton of World War II novels, which is wonderful because that's what I love to read. So I'm very happy that that's the trend right now.
Yeah, we're not complaining. Don't get me wrong.
No complaints. No complaints. Writing was sort of on the early edge of that. And I didn't write that book thinking like, hey, this is a trend. I wrote it thinking this is the book that's in my heart right now to write. And for me, I think it was very much about connecting with a past that was about to disappear. Just like you said, I think a lot of people who lived through World War II, whether they were children during the war or whether they were soldiers or whether they were concentration camp survivors or, whatever. I think the generation that lived through World War II and the generation of people who were young people during World War II were beginning to lose them. And for me, it was very much a personal book because I wrote it at a time that I had just lost my grandfather, who had been in the Merchant Marines during World War II. And I had a lot of regrets about not knowing his stories. And I think that oftentimes that generation didn't share their stories, particularly the stories that had a little bit of darkness to them. That was just sort of a generational thing, I think, for a lot of people. So that's something that I get emails from readers about very, very frequently. People say all the time, I have a grandparent who survived the Holocaust or survived a concentration camp, and they've never talked about it. This helped to open a dialogue. And so that seems to be a thread that's familiar to a lot of people. So for me, I think writing that book and looking at that time period was a way to look at my own family's past, even though the things that happened in the book didn't happen to my family. Those were things that I researched and, made up. But I think looking back at that period was a real connection to my own grandparents, and it seems like that's what people have found in that book also. Does that make sense and answer the
Absolutely.
question? I think
Absolutely.
we're just looking, so I think for readers, they're looking at their grandparents or their parents, and watching that generation fade away, and realizing that sometimes we've missed the stories that we should have heard from them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and it's so strange for our generation. I'm assuming you and I are close to the same age. I grew up as a little kid. Vietnam was still going on. And I didn't really know anything about it. But you would see things on TV, and then as a young adult, the first Iraq War and we've seen this stuff play out on TV, and now in the internet age, you see this. And then I remember talking to my grandparents and great uncles. And trying to get them to talk about it, and you would just hear, "Oh, you don't want to hear about that,"
Yes.
And it's so locked up in mystery.
Yep.
And maybe that's what it is. Our grandparents are leaving us, and we're left with mementos and things of them, and wondering what the stories are that connect these.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And another thing I think that's appealing about World War II fiction is, in a lot of cases, there's a clear-cut good guy and a clear-cut bad guy. Like, how we were talking before about sports stories, how you want to kind of find the good guy and root for the good guy. I feel like maybe that's something else. Most readers and most people have a little bit of background on World War II, enough to understand, here's who we're rooting for. But I also like the idea that even on the, the quote unquote, or, just like on the side that you're not supposed to be rooting for, there could still be good people, or on the side you are supposed to be rooting for, there could still be bad people. Like, I think it's one of those things that you begin with this feeling of good and bad that's ingrained in all of us. And you can sort of, it makes for a broader stage to tell the story on, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
and hopefully it helps us to connect with our own humanity at some point.
Absolutely.
When we see that the good guys sometimes are not what we hold them up to be, and sometimes the bad guys are in a bad situation at the wrong place at the wrong time, and maybe that helps us wrestle with our own humanity sometimes.
Absolutely. I think you're right. And I think it's something that sort of has echoes in what's going on in today's world, and probably, always will at whatever point we are in time. It's sort of a story that, although it's set in the past, there are a lot of things that it has in common with the present, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
So your new book, The Room on Rue Amelie, is the fifth book in this kind of, not series, but this new stage in your publishing. So how would you describe these 5 books as to someone who's not familiar with you and your work? How would you kind of set up the progression of these books?
Oh, goodness. Well, first of all, I would say it's 4 novels and 1 novella. So you were right about it being 5, but one of them was something that, amusingly enough, started off as, oh, hey, I have this idea for a short story. Let's just do this for fun, and it can be something we can email to readers on my newsletter or whatever. And it just got away from me as I started writing it, and it wound up at like 60,000 words, which is not a short story. So my publisher was like, okay, I guess we could do this as a novella. So it's a novella that's available by ebook. It's called How to Save a Life. So that one's a little bit different than the others. That doesn't quite fit in the progression, because it's I would say it's Groundhog Day meets Grey's Anatomy. So it's not really a historical novel.
I love it.
It was a fun little idea I had. And, I know you're a writer too, Hank. And I think, tell me if you feel the same way. Sometimes I just get an idea in my head, and I know I can't move on with anything else until I've gotten that idea out on paper. So that was what that novella was. And I'm like, I need to write this.
we talk about a lot about the writers. We just write down what the voisos in our head tell us to do. And if you don't do what they tell you to, they won't leave you alone.
They're really mean, those voices. Exactly. So that was that novella, which is not exactly, it's in the tone of what I'm writing now, but it was a little bit different. So the 4 novels, 3 of them, including The Room on Rue Amelie, are historical. And one of them, The Life Intended, has very much the same tone, but it's set in the present day. And in terms of the progression of those, it's interesting. I am very proud of those books, but I also read them and see that I've grown with each one. And I think I've developed more courage in my own storytelling, if that makes sense. The Sweetness of Forgetting, the 2012 book I mentioned, it's probably my second favorite book I've written after The Room on Rue Amelie. But I do look at it and realize that I still was tentative in the way I told a story. I think I thought I had to stay rooted in the way I was telling stories before. And so I think the progression is that I've given myself permission to go a little bit farther with each book, if that makes sense. And The Room on Rue Amelie, I think, is different than the others in that the others were set at least partially in the present, and The Room on Rue Amelie is grounded almost entirely in the past. So the first chapter and the last chapter take place in 2002, which isn't quite present day, but it's, more or less present day. And then the entire rest of the book takes place in the past. And that was actually something that was partially my editor, because in the first draft of the book, I had the 2002 chapters interspersed, maybe every 5 chapters or so. And she was 100% right in that it worked better just to frame the past story. So it was an interesting book for me to write, because writing something entirely set in the past, and I would love to talk to other historical fiction authors about this, it's scary because you have to have every detail right. Whereas when you're writing books that are set in the present and in the past, you can kind of jump away from the chapters if there's, if you don't know how they would have lit a room or heated a room or something in 1940, you can kind of do your best, but you don't need every single little detail. But when you're stuck entirely in the past, you need every single detail to be right, which to me is daunting. So I think it sounds like a silly thing to say, but that was a big leap for me to say, okay, I can do this research and I'm going to get it all right, I hope. So, yeah.
No, I think a lot of people struggle with that because, and especially for the reasons we talked about earlier, is people are really paying attention.
Yes,
and they really want to feel a deep connection.
Yep.
And they want that connection to be real. And if you, put a cell phone, and then people are going to send you hate mail.
Well, you're completely right. Yeah.
And obviously more closer details than that. But people are real sticklers because we do want these stories to be true. We even if they're made up characters, we want to feel like our heroes are real heroes.
Well, and there's something I think as a reader, if you stumble across a detail, even a small detail that you know is wrong, it takes you out of the story a little bit, and you feel a tiny bit betrayed. I mean, not like the author's done it on purpose, but I think you sort of feel like, wait, I know that's not right. So, but as a writer, it's very scary because there are things you assume you know, and so you don't think to check them. So, for example, you might write, that someone's standing on a street in Paris, in 1941, and they see headlights bobbing along from the end of the street. Well, but would headlights have been bobbing along from the end of the street in Paris in 1941, or would the headlights have been blacked out? You know what I mean? So there are a million little things like that you might not stop to consider. But that if you were reading it and you knew the answer to that question, I feel like it would take you out of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the story of the room on Rue Amelie.
That's a good idea since I've now discussed.
What's the who are the characters and what's the setup for it?
So the room on Rue Amelie is the story of an American woman in Paris, a French Jewish teenager, and a British Royal Air Force pilot whose lives collide in Paris during World War II. So it is about roughly kind of about the Allied escape lines that took place in and around Paris during World War II. And it is a story told from all three of those different viewpoints. You sort of see all of them as they all come closer together and then as their lives intertwine. And it was a really very interesting book for me to write. I lived for a little while when I was in my early 20s. And The Sweetness of Forgetting is also set partially in Paris. And so I'm fascinated by the World War II history there. And I came across a book a few years ago about a woman named Virginia Dalbert Lake. I came across the book actually when I was researching When We Meet Again, 2016 novel. And Virginia Dalbert Lake, who passed away several years ago, was an American woman living in Paris during the war and wound up helping on some of the Allied escape lines. So this book is not based on her. As I read her book, it's a memoir written by her. I was fascinated not just by the story she told, but by the many ways our lives overlapped. I mean, her first writing job had also been for the St. Petersburg Times. She'd also grown up in St. Petersburg. She also lived for a portion of her life in, which is where I live. I mean, I sort of felt like she was like this spiritual sister from a different generation. And her story was fascinating to me and sort of gave me the idea of Ruby, the main character in The Room on Rue Amelie. So they're very different people whose stories are very different. But there's a little bit of Virginia in Ruby.
The book is up for pre-order right now. I highly encourage everyone to go pick up a copy. I've been reading The Room on Rue Amelie, and from page one, you are right into the story. So congratulations on such an epic novel.
Thanks.
Kristen, if people are not familiar with you and your work, where can they find you online to learn more about you or follow you along on your adventures?
That is a great question. Well, my website is KristenHarmel.com, and that's Kristin, Harmel, HARMEL.com. And using that same name, you can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Kristen Harmel is my handle on Instagram and Twitter, and on Facebook, I think it's Kristen Harmel Author. So I'm pretty easy to find there. I'm horrible about updating my Instagram, but I read Instagram. No, seriously, like I'm terrible at this. It's awful. I need to get better. I'm working on it. I do post stuff on there, but I need to be better. I'm just a terrible picture taker, which is like at the heart of Instagram, obviously. So.
I feel like people that just post quotes or something like that and write something in Notepad and screenshot. I feel like that's cheating.
Well, and that's pretty much what I do because I'm like, well, this looks pretty because it's created by somebody else. It's like my words, but thank you so much.
Well, there it is, people. Kristen Harmel is an Instagram cheater. We've outed her today.
That's right. And Instagram cheater, also bad at math. So let's just run down my list of flaws here.
Great callback. Kristen, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. I wish you much success with the room on Rue Amelie, and we're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of it.
Well, thank you so much, and good luck with your novels, too. You are also quite prolific, so I am, good luck with your books. They look fantastic, and I cannot wait to get my hands on a few.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason yanked the coils of safety rope to one shoulder and heaved them out the attic window. The bundle bounced over the roofline and dropped to the yard below. He tightened the harness, making sure the shoulder straps were snug over his sweatshirt. He threaded his rope through the braking device, tested it, and clipped everything to the carabiner at his navel. So far, so good. Fireman Mike would be proud. His stomach flipped as he neared the octagonal window. Had he tied the correct knots? Would he get himself killed? Weeks had passed since Mike's tutorial but he had to attempt the break-in now, while both Van Brunts were at the Christmas Eve service. He swung his legs through the window and felt for the roof. His sneakers gripped the shingles and he wriggled out, grateful for once to have feet as big as snowshoes. He pulled on a ski mask and sang, "Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can." He lowered his body. Wind punched him in the jaw like a supervillain, surprising him. His sweatshirt rode up and snow burrowed into his navel. He looked down but couldn't see his feet. He relaxed his hands and put a few ounces of weight on the rope. Clots of snow broke away, dove over the edge, and took far too long to hit ground. He drew his rope around the pipe and pulled tight. Now he could drop. No, you will not drop. You will rappel. You will rappel very safely. He backed towards the edge, towards the point of no return. The backyard lurched into view. It was a 4-story fall, and he'd probably hit the stairs on the way down. He sledded helplessly. His legs fell, swung, and kicked the side of the house. Alarm bells went off in his head. He gripped the rope. It looked like nothing. A shoelace. Jason Crane, you're a damn fool. He went limp and fell over. The rope gave a jolt, and the harness tried to castrate him. He twisted, trying to save his poor descendants. He began to spin. His arm bashed through a row of icicles. The spin slowed, reversed, and at last he came to a stop with his back to the house, dangling over the backyard. Thank you, rope. That's a good rope. Well done. He tried to turn around, but couldn't. With patience, he worked out a method of kicking in circles and managed to press his sneakers to the side of the house. He needed slack. He gathered his loose rope to the small of his back and disengaged the brake. Zip! He fell fast, all his weight on the rope now. His feet, planted, shot up over his head. The brake caught him, and the rope vibrated as wildly as a guitar string striking a note of panic. Jason heard a crunching sound and looked up. The leaf gutter crumpled and poured a stream of bitter ice water into his eyes. He snarled and wiped his face, dripping humiliation. Jason rested a moment and stared at his reflection in the glass. He was an enormous Macy's balloon drifting over New Jersey, tethered at the navel like underdog. How the hell did you get up here, kid? He did an awkward split, one foot above the window and the other below, hanging sideways with his weight on one hip. He closed his eyes and reached for the sill, crouching against the side of the house. His fingernails found the weather stripping, and he tugged. Locked. He cursed and tugged again, anger rising. He grabbed the frame with both hands and pulled with all his spider strength. Something popped. The window rose and the curtains splashed out. Jason dove headfirst into the fabric, wriggled and kicked, let out some rope and fell with a whump into his archenemy's lair.